with the
Thank you.
recording. I am a veterinary social worker that works directly and hands-on with veterinary professionals and veterinarians. I also work another job that works with animal welfare and rescue organizations, again doing coaching and working on dynamics and relationships around intentional well-being. So
Thank
that's what I do.
you. Thanks. Shannon.
Hi, I'm Shannon. I am currently a clinical social worker in a human medical clinic and working on my certificate in veterinary social work through University of Tennessee, and I reside in Vermont.
Thank you. Matt.
Yeah, sorry. So I am Matt Gallardo. So I live in upstate New York, and I just recently finished my Master of Social Work. I have been working at an animal shelter in my area for several years, and yeah, and then also happen to be the treasurer for the IAVSW
Good
with
to
some of
see
these
you.
wonderful people on here.
Thank you. And Kristen.
Kristen, and I am an intern at the IAVSW and going to school for my MSW at Case Western in Cleveland.
Thank you. Okay, over to you, Mary and Amy. Thank you.
Okay, sorry, my screen might have been flicking around. I'm not the best. I'm not very IT savvy, so hopefully I can get through the slides. So we haven't got long today. So I think what we'll do, if it's okay with you, is I'll share in the first section a very high level overview of some of the research that I completed here in the UK. There's lots of great research out there about the link between domestic abuse and animal abuse. It's an area we've been researching since the 1990s. Most of that research has been done in America, Canada, New Zealand. And my study was the first study to take place in the UK, looking at the link between domestic abuse and animal abuse. Amy's going to talk a bit more. So the second session, Amy will talk about a bit more about the UK context and very much some of the risks that we see associated with animals and survivors of domestic abuse. Let's just keep it really informal because it's such a lovely small group. We're not used to nice small groups. So, shout out your questions, but we'll leave about 10 minutes at the end for questions too. We'll be guided by you. If there's stuff you want to know or explore, then shout out. Right, hopefully I can move this on. Oh, I knew that was going to happen. The thing is, I can't get rid of my finder at the bottom, so I can't see how to click through. Oh, hang on. I think I can hide it. Oh, sorry, guys.
Can you just do the page up, page down, or the arrows?
Won't let me do it. But
maybe under more, sometimes you can do hide floating controls.
Hide
floating controls.
I just got it to click on though, didn't I? This isn't going to be easy.
Something happened.
Yeah. Oh. Might have to ask Amy to share. Amy, have you got the slides? Is Amy still there?
Yeah.
Yep, she's here.
Up for you.
Shall I stop sharing?
Yeah,
Thanks, Amy. She's my savior. I'll start talking though.
Yeah.
So we don't waste time. So the first slide is about a bit of a trigger warning. So we are going to share some experiences of survivors in terms of how their animals were abused in the household. And it sounds like you're very well versed in hearing this type of content, but it is hard. It is hard to hear the experiences of survivors, what people and animals go through. So that's all the first slide is really. Amy, you're a legend. So talking about that research that I completed. So I started the research, I finished the research in 2021. If we can go on to the next slide, Amy, that would be cool. And what I set out to explore was the link between domestic abuse and animal abuse. But actually, what I quite quickly found is it's more than a link. Animal abuse is a very specific strategy used by perpetrators to coerce and control the human victim survivors in the household. And I spoke to 107 survivors of domestic abuse all across the UK, and animals were abused in 94 of those households. Now, we do need to be a bit careful with that because, of course, I was specifically looking for people that had experiences of domestic abuse and animal abuse. But if we look at the research, quite recent research completed by Amy Fitzgerald in Canada, her cites that 89% of in households where there are animals and domestic abuse, those animals were abused in 89% of those households. And my research was 88%. It's almost impossible to put a number on this because we know, and it will be exactly the same in the United States, it'd be exactly the same globally. Domestic abuse is massively underreported. Although we've all made lots of progress, it does very much remain a hidden crime. And when we think about coercive control, there's lots of myths about coercive control. You know, it's the non-violent form of domestic abuse. Actually, coercive control can be very violent, and there is almost always a level of violence or a threat of violence, particularly, well, that's a sweeping statement. So when we think about animals, we hear it all the time. If you leave, I'm going to kill the dog. If you leave, you're not going to get your cats back. So that perpetrator might not have actually been at all violent to the survivor, the human survivor, but that threat's still there. You know, you break the rules, this is what's going to happen. So, I mean, coercive control is extremely complex, and many of you will have had training around this. Perpetrators will use tactics, some of them are here, you know, and ultimately to trap that survivor in the relationship. And it's very difficult to recognize it because some of these things in isolation, you know, don't seem that bad. But when you put them together and you build the dynamics and the pattern, you know, you get a sense of the fear and the control that that person's subjected to. So the reason I put this here, though, is because we've done lots and lots of work in the UK to really raise awareness about how animals are used in the dynamics of domestic abuse. And, you know, we see it every day in our practice, as I'm sure you do. Can I have the next slide, please, Amy? So following the research, has anybody seen this? The power and control wheel, yeah, developed in Duluth back in the 80s. We use it so widely in the UK. It's used right across our domestic abuse services, used with survivors to help them understand their experience of domestic abuse. And we worked with the Domestic Abuse Intervention Programme in Duluth to get this updated, to have this extra cog in the wheel using animals. Because it's so, so important. There are lots of parallels between how perpetrators abuse children or use children and how they will abuse animals as well and use animals. I'm not going to go into that in much detail. You can have this updated version. It's not on the Duluth website, but it's officially adapted and we can share it. Can I have the next slide, please, Amy? So let's talk a little bit about the bond, and this is probably just reiterating what you already know. But going back to my research where I spoke to the 107 survivors, they all really talked about this unique bond that they had with their animals. Many had children, but they really described that bond as very unique. And, you know, as we know, you know, it's that unconditional love. So they talked about that love, that companionship, that bond, animals providing a sense of escapism and purpose, you know, living in the world that is domestic abuse, just being able to focus on their animals, you know, just to take their mind off what they were living with day in, day out, provided a really important sense of escapism. And also, you know, some survivors talked about their animals preventing them from suiciding. And again, my research isn't the first piece of research to find that. We go back to Dr. Amy Fitzgerald's research. That's a key finding in hers as well. So that bond is so important, as we know. And we know that survivors won't leave. if they can't take their animals with them. There is also another way that perpetrators, lots of ways that perpetrators use animals, but they will also exploit our fear of animals. So one survivor talked about how the perpetrator brought in a large bull breed. She loves dogs, but she was, slightly intimidated by this dog. He encouraged her to be abusive towards the dog, which, challenged her, that was really challenging for her. She loved animals. And he would encourage the dog to be aggressive towards her. And he brought a snake into the household, and she is petrified of snakes. And he would leave the vivarium open. So even when the perpetrator wasn't at home, she was still living in absolute terror. Where is that snake? When's it going to come out? Really scary. So that relationship to survivors is so, so important. That animal is often the only other living being in that household who truly knows what's going on. When our children are asleep at night, that dog sat on the sofa with us, we talk to them and we don't put a filter on. So they really do walk this with us. And, they develop very similar safety strategies. They walk on eggshells like we do quite often. Next slide, please, Amy. So, a famous quote from Phil Arkow, and as you will know, Phil, I'm sure, American researcher, and who set up the National Links Coalition, who we are also members of. So, when people are abused, animals are at risk, and vice versa. Well, absolutely. It makes perfect sense, doesn't it? If somebody's willing to do that to a person, they're willing to do it to an animal, absolutely. And these things coexist. There's the graduation theory that criminals, perpetrators will practice on animals and graduate to people. Actually, these things happen in parallel. These people, these perpetrators, they're abusing people, they're abusing animals. Just going back to prevalence, so if we look across the research, like I said, it's almost impossible to put a figure on this, and we love to put figures on things, don't we? We want to know how big a problem is this. The research would highlight, would generally think between half of all households impacted by domestic abuse, and like I said, up to 89% animals will be abused by the perpetrator. Of course, not always. That's not always the case, but it is very common. Next slide, please, Amy. So I'm just going to talk a bit more about my research. And this will be, this isn't unique to the UK at all. It happened in the UK context, but it's not at all unique to the UK. This will be the same where you are. So in these households, this is how animals were abused. They were physically abused, and I apologise. This is a tricky area, and then this next little bit is quite hard to listen to. But they are physically abused, brutally and intentionally physically abused. We're talking about beheading, punching, kicking, beating, poisoning, drowning. Absolutely horrific torture. Neglect. We see this a lot on our projects. So animals are neglected in terms of, denying their basic needs, food, water, companionship, the right environment, high levels of control around the animals in the household as well, but also denying vet treatment. See this all the time. You're not taking that dog to the vets. So we didn't really introduce ourselves in terms of, I know Rebecca did, but both Amy and I run specialist domestic abuse animal fostering services in the UK. So we're taking in animals all the time when families escape to safety. And it's very common for us to see animals coming into the project that have been denied vet treatment. It's a tactic of the abuse. Again, really hard, isn't it? Because we've sort of talked about that bond, how we feel about our animals, and then to be prevented from taking them to the vets is really horrific, part of that coercive control. Threats to harm, absolutely. If you break the rules of the relationship, this is going to happen, and this is going to happen to your animal. And really widely used. And also, animals are threatened. They're emotionally abused, they're psychologically abused by the perpetrator, being yelled at, that's very impactful for them. But what I wasn't prepared for was the number of animals that were murdered in these households. Animals were murdered by the perpetrator in 13 households. And at least 21 animals were murdered, multiple animals in some of these households. And they were directly murdered and indirectly murdered. And by directly, I mean, they were beaten to death, they were run over, they were beheaded. But indirectly means the perpetrator orchestrated a scenario where the animals would almost certainly die. So, for example, one survivor talked about how the family were going out to the cinema trip, so this mandatory family night out, and the perpetrator was left to shut the house up. Mum and a 4-year-old son got into the car and off they went. What he'd done is they had a lot of animals, and he had put the cats, the rodents, and the birds in the living room and left all of their cages open. So you can imagine what Mum came home to, standing in that doorway, her and her 4-year-old son. Now, she can't prove that he did that, but she knew he did it. She knew it was him. And she went on to talk about other examples of where she'd been isolated from her family, but she liked to go home and see her family. And what she found was animals would be murdered. And again, she can't prove it, but she'd get a phone call to say the hamsters died. So eventually she stopped going home. She became more and more isolated. And of course, animals don't just experience one form of abuse like humans in the household. They will often experience multiple forms of abuse. And there's a type of abuse that's missing here, and that's the sexual abuse of animals. So in my naivety as an early career researcher, I didn't ask about the sexual abuse of animals. And survivors will carry a huge amount of shame and blame about what happened to the animals. For many of the people that took part in my research, I was the first person that they spoke to about what happened to the animals, because of course they're so scared of, the repercussions of saying what's happened to the animals, because they think professionals are going to judge them, blame them, that we have the Animal Welfare Agency in the UK, the RSPCA. So they think that law enforcement, animal welfare are going to come in and take the animals and ban them from having animals. So that shame and blame that they carry is really quite significant. Can we have the next slide, please, Amy? I better speed up as well. I'm going to be a bit selective about my slides. So thinking about those 94 households, in the UK, there's more dogs than cats in households. There's about, I think 51% of all households have an animal in the UK, according to the PDSA pet population data. But it wasn't the species of animals that made them susceptible to the abuse. It was the bond that the survivor had. Perpetrators targeted animals in the household where the survivor was most bonded to those animals. Doesn't matter what species those animals are. And at Refuge for Pets, the charity that I run, we foster all species of animals. So it's important that we remember that. And as professionals, it's really important that we ask about animals, but also we ask about the unseen animals that might be in the household. So I'm going to share an experience, and I always share this because when I listen to Anne talk about the abuse that she went through and the abuse that her animals went through, that's the moment I thought, yeah, this is coercive control. This is a definition of coercive control. So Anne is a primary school teacher, and she was the second survivor that I spoke to in the research process. And she was kind of a go-to for the local animal rescue centres. She would foster the animals, she would rehome animals. She was quite an expert in terms of exotic animals. They had 4 dogs. They would always go to the rescues and get the older, bigger dogs that potentially would be overlooked. Now, he didn't abuse the dogs, or not directly. They were exposed to the domestic abuse in the household. But, he was quite caring towards the dogs on the whole. They had what they needed. He would call them up, come and sit on the sofa, give me some attention. It was all on his terms. But he didn't abuse the dogs directly. Anne never knew what she was coming home to. because he would tamper with the setups for the exotic animals. He would turn off lamps and heat mats, and he fed a lizard to one of her dogs. And she had 4 big fish tanks, and she really loved those fish tanks. Those fish were her escapism and purpose. So thinking about what I said earlier, you know, fish are really hard to look after, and she put a lot of time into caring for those fish. She liked to do that. And I'll put Anne's words on the screen actually, if we can have the next slide, Amy. This is what Anne said. She had 3 big fish tanks, and she'd nurtured those fish, some tiny little fish, and he would threaten, he would throw things in there. That's that threat that we talked about, which is always there in coercive control. He would pull the fish out, the unspoken threat. And one day she couldn't remember what it was. It was so stupid. She got home late, the dinner wasn't ready, and he went into the kitchen, he took the bleach and he poured it into that water. And she basically just had to sit there and watch her fish die. You know, that is absolutely horrific. He did that to punish her, because she broke the rules, whatever the rule was. That was his way of punishing her. And that's what survivors all talked about, was that when I said, why did this person do this to your animals? It was always about to punish me, to control me, because he was jealous of the animals, the relationship I had with the animals, just like he was jealous of the relationship that I had with the children. And the next slide, please, Amy, and I'm going to skip through a couple. So I've talked about this. So, I mean, the impact is massive. It's very significant. The trauma that survivors will carry from the domestic abuse and seeing their children and their animals abused. But the point of this slide is that people will not go if they can't take their animals. And in the UK, we have less refuges that will take animals, but we have more animal fostering services, which Amy will talk a bit more about. Next slide, please, Amy. Just want to pull out one point on this slide, that in these households, in my research, there were animals in most of the households, and they were almost always were exposed to the abuse of the animals, witnessed the abuse of the animals. They were used to give messages to mum. Daddy said, if you're not back, he's going to kill another one of your rabbits. So, you know, there are so many parallels between how the perpetrator abused the animals and the children. We could do a whole, day's training on this alone. Next slide, please, Amy. I'm very briefly going to mention this. So you may not have heard of Professor Jane Monckton-Smith. Jane is very well known in the UK, and I think in the United States as well, around her homicide timeline work, where she looked at 4,000 domestic abuse cases. And what she's done is she's put this together, this 8 stages of homicide. And she's got lots of books, there's lots on the internet about it. It's really interesting, really easy to follow. We're doing lots of training on this in the UK, delivered by Jane. But she talks about the stages of a relationship, and they don't just have to go up, they can go round and, back and forth. And, one stage isn't necessarily an indicator that there's going to be a homicide. But what we want to do in the UK is map animals onto this, because in my research, we can already start to do some of that. So we think about domestic abuse, high-risk domestic abuse, homicide. In the UK, 3 women will be murdered by a partner or family member each week. And we're just starting to really get our heads around domestic abuse-related suicide and work around that area. But the point of this is we want professionals to be asking and thinking about the animals across this, because they're so important. Poor animal welfare and the abuse of animals is an indicator of homicide to the people in the household, and of course those animals who, as we've heard, are quite often murdered. These are the animals that don't get to the vets, that no one looks for. I'm only going to pull out a couple of stages because it's quite interesting, but obviously horrific. Stage 1 in Jane's timeline is about history. So thinking about domestic abuse relationships, is there a history? Is there a history of domestic abuse, stalking and harassment? Because that is a red flag straight away. But actually, is there a history of any crime? Is there a history of animal cruelty? Because that's a red flag. And survivors in my research, some of them talked about how the perpetrator bragged about killing cats, shooting them with an air rifle, mistreating animals. Red flag early on. So listen out for that. Ask about it. Ask about the animals. The early relationship was key. That's when animals often entered the household in my research. Oh, look at me. I'm such a wonderful partner. I got my girlfriend that dog she'd always wanted, that foal she's always wanted. It's that relationship whirlwind. It's moving fast, commitment. Because actually, when we start bringing animals into the household, just like when we start bringing children in, it's a good way to trap someone. You know, it's very hard to leave a domestic abuse relationship, but when you've got to leave with, 2 children, 2 dogs, and 2 bearded dragons, it becomes almost overwhelming. And we found that perpetrators will often encourage more and more animals into the household to trap the survivor in that relationship. And as we go through more stages, stage 4, stage 5, which is about, escalation, triggers, escalation, that's when the threats to the animals might turn to the physical abuse, and the physical abuse might turn to the murder of animals. So that's why it's so important that we're thinking about animals at all stages. And I think I better leave my bit at that. We have created that abuse of animals wheel that is on the Domestic Abuse Intervention Programme's website. And the reason we did this was to try and relieve some of that shame and blame that survivors have, and support professionals to have conversations with survivors about the animals. Okay, what happened to your animals? This is all part of the domestic abuse. And of course, we want this information because we want to hold perpetrators to account for what they're doing to the animals. And I'll hand over to Amy. I don't think we've got time for a quick 5-minute break. That's our next slide. Sorry about that.
Thanks, Mary. Yeah, if everyone's happy, we can just power on through. Perfect. Okay. Yeah, so as Mary mentioned, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of our pet fostering services in the UK. So as Mary mentioned, the vast majority of women's refuges, emergency accommodation across the UK does not accept pets. It does vary regionally, but we would probably estimate it between 70% in a local region to 100% of services and accommodation not accepting pets. We see a little bit more in Scotland, and we're starting to see a little bit more where refuge provision is moving slightly away from shared accommodation, where we've got quite often it's set up as shared living space, shared children's room, shared garden area, entrance hallway. We are seeing more refuges set up now that have self-contained flats, so smaller properties with own kitchen area. A little bit more practical for pets coming in and out of those properties, not as practical coming out of coming into shared accommodation, where we have multiple different families with young children coming and going, and then multiple different dogs, cats, all with various experiences and behavioural impacts of the abuse that they've been through. So one of the elements that we offer through our services is absolutely free and absolutely confidential pet fostering. So for a lot of clients that access our service and look for support, in a lot of cases, they've gotten through all of those many challenges and barriers to actually get to the point where they're able to reach out for support. They're making those first few steps. And very often they'll be told as they reach out for that they have a space where they can go to with their children, but there's absolutely no way that the pets can come as well. And therefore we get those calls through to us on a daily basis. They've got somewhere to go, but there's no way they're leaving without the animal. And just as Mary has described, how could you possibly be in a situation where you are leaving behind the one animal that has been there for you throughout, sat with you, been your children's best friend throughout everything, but also you've had the perpetrator, which has been threatening the life of the animal and potentially seen some of the most horrific, abuse of the animal as well. How are you going to be in a position where you're going to leave that pet behind when you leave, knowing what could happen to them? And that is what a lot of our clients will tell us, that if they stay, they find that easier because at least they're there to protect them. They can't bear the thought of going and not knowing what's going to happen to this pet. So it really is between staying and going for a lot of the clients that we work with. So as a group, we've got 4 specialist services in the UK that operate under our links group. And our links group, you may already be aware, is an interagency group that's bringing across professionals, organisations from human sectors through to animal sectors, and really raising awareness and educating on the link between abuse to animals and abuse to people. So we sit sort of underneath that main group as a links pet fostering group, and it's made up of my organisation, which is Cats Protection. We work specifically with cats. We also work closely with Dogs Trust, who offer the same for dogs under Freedom, and then Mary's organisation, Refuge for Pets, down in the southwest of England, and Endeavour in the northwest. And we've grown the services considerably over the past. They launched roughly 20 years ago, but they have grown considerably over the past sort of 6 to 10 years. We're almost there with UK-wide coverage for pet fostering services, and I think it won't be too long now until we reach the full coverage. But together we've got 74 years of combined experience in this area. And really everything that we do, all of the ways in which we work, our policies, our processes, are all embedded through learned experience through these years. I think when I started actually in Dogs Trust Freedom about 12 years ago, and what we know now about the way that perpetrators use animals, the different tools that they bring in, and the different levels of barriers that survivors are experiencing, is nowhere near what we knew then. We've really adapted a lot of our ways of working to make sure that we're keeping animals and people safe. And I'll chat through a little bit more of those in a bit more detail to give you an idea. But on the whole, some of our core standards within the group is to be absolutely free for anybody accessing the service. So as Mary said, a lot of our clients have experienced economic abuse. They've had no access to finances. They've had the perpetrator running up huge debts in their name, stopping them from working, particularly with everything with COVID and moving to more of a home working, smashing up laptops whilst they're working at home, stopping access to making phone calls. A lot of the clients that access our service would just not have the money to pay or to contribute in any way to the service. So it's a really important part of removing barriers to making sure it's free. It's also completely confidential as well, so that's another big part of what we do. So when pets are under our care, we actually don't have any contact between the family member that's bringing the pet into our care and the temporary foster carer who's looking after the pet. So we act as sort of a go-between across the 2 different parties, and that's really to protect everybody's involvement, both the volunteer that's caring for the pet, as well as the owner as well. And then we've got a whole host of other processes in place, like only using unmarked vehicles. We only have female team members within the service, and we have processes in place for how we manage data, how we support clients. And again, it's constantly adapting. So as a group, we come together very regularly to review this. And we also support other organisations who are thinking of setting something like this up as well, to really go through all of those learnings and potential risks that we need to be thinking about. So first of all, just touching on pets as a barrier. So we've got a couple of different pieces of research. So we have one here from Dogs Trust, where we asked domestic abuse professionals, this is what we see in our service. When you've been supporting someone, has a pet been a barrier for them getting to safety? And we had 9 in 10 professionals saying yes, they've supported people that will not leave their home until they knew their pet would be safe. And we did this question at Cats Protection 2 years ago, and it came down to 90%. Sort of hoping that means that actually the pet fostering services are having a bigger impact there, that we are seeing it potentially as less of a barrier. But one of the things that we try and get across when we're working with domestic abuse professionals, housing teams, social workers, even if the bond element isn't at the forefront of your mind, so that protecting that bond between the person and the pet is so crucial to the victim survivors' safety and ongoing recovery as well. It's very common for us to see where pets have been left behind with the perpetrator still trying to use the animal as a tool for coercive control, for post-separation abuse, after the family have fled, and trying to bring them back into the relationship, back into the home. So much so of sending photos of the dogs in various situations as a threat that if you don't return, this is what's going to happen to your pets. And someone always comes to mind in relation to that referred on to our service back when I was at Freedom, and she referred and said, I absolutely have to get the dogs out this time. We fled 3 years ago, and we went back within a number of days because we were receiving these threats to the dogs. And then she and the children were in that situation then for years after that. So it's that important moment of making sure we're bringing everybody out to safety. So as well as keeping the pets and the animals safe, it's also a huge safety implication for the victim survivor as well. So when we're looking at some options, and this is really talking about in the UK context, but it may also apply, in America as well. So we know it's going to take such a huge step to actually get to the point of leaving an abusive person. You can see from that homicide timeline, seeing the risk potentially move up and move up and move up, getting to the point where leaving is one of the most dangerous times for the victim survivor. So when they get to that point and they are looking for the options, it might be looking at refuge accommodation, might be other emergency accommodation, might be staying with friends or family. And this is really where we're looking to flee as well. Obviously, we may have clients that are exploring their options, but actually are able to safely remain in the property. But for a lot of the clients we're supporting, they're needing to flee out of area, no trace from the perpetrator, really fleeing for their lives and for the children's lives at that point. And we've discussed, obviously, the majority of refuges in the UK are not able to accept pets. So when we're looking at some of those options of if you make that phone call, you're offered somewhere safe to go, but you're told that you can't bring your pet with you, what are some of the options? It may be friends or family. So it may be that you've got someone close to you that's able to take your pet in. But what we do know, because of the nature of domestic abuse, is so often your family circle, your friends is going to be so minimized. You're potentially going to be isolated. You may not have the same people that you could have relied on previously. But also finding friends or family to take in pets last minute for a long period of time as well is not always the most practical option. I certainly cannot find anybody to take in my dogs last minute or anytime, but I'm conscious that might be because of how they behave when they go out and about. But it's not always the most easy thing to do. And there might also be safety risks there as well. So if you have a local neighbour that's caring for your dog and out walking them in the park, that perpetrator could potentially spot the dog, spot the neighbour. They know how much their ex-partner cared for the dog. They know that potentially that neighbour is going to have a window of communication back with the partner. And again, we could be putting that neighbour at risk. We could also be introducing a potential link where the perpetrator can then go and find the victim survivor as well. So some considerations there could be positive, could not be. We see some really positive situations sometimes where, particularly I would say with dogs, have experienced so much abuse within that situation. They're also their social roots, who they know, people, their environment has been so limited because of the domestic abuse that they actually do not cope very well at all coming into foster homes with new people, new environments. And actually having somebody that already knows the dog, has already been familiar, the dog is comfortable with, that might be a much better option for the dog in that circumstance as well. So again, there's pros and cons with each one, but oh, Mary, I can see you've raised your hand.
I'm only going to give a gentle 5-minute warning.
Oh goodness, okay, I will speed up. Thanks, Mary. We could be looking at private boarding facilities, but again, we've talked about the economic abuse element and paying for boarding for that amount of time. Our average placements fostering are 6 to 9 months, but it's not unusual for them to go into 12 months. So again, we've got the welfare implications of those animals being boarded for a long period too. So something just to think about. Permanently rehomed could be an option for some pets. And as Mary mentioned, we do sometimes see victim survivors where the perpetrator has brought so many animals into the household because it's so much harder to leave with that many pets. But actually, for the majority of people we're working with, they do not want to give up their pets at all. And also, again, speaking specifically within the UK, our rehoming centres are absolutely full. So trying to get an animal into rescue within a couple of days is not always going to be possible. And then obviously another option is leaving behind. And that may be an option that somebody takes. There may not have been any abuse to the animal previously. But again, something we always warn is that change and that victim survivor leaving and the perpetrator realizing that animal is the only thing that's been left, and that attachment that they know that their partner has with the animal. We do see that's one of the most risky times that an animal may come to quite significant harm by the perpetrator, and sadly have seen it happen multiple situations over the years. So again, just that importance of trying to make sure that both the victim survivor, children and pets are brought out at the same time. I'm going to really quickly touch on in relation to our Domestic Abuse Act, which came in 2021. It covers England and Wales. But for the first time, this was a really groundbreaking piece of legislation on the whole for domestic abuse. But for the first time, it also brought in animals into statutory guidance, which sits under the Act. So you can see here, because we've got up to number 70, there is a lot of different descriptions and examples of the different types of abuse, controlling coercive behaviour, emotional, psychological, all the different types of abuse. But we've got the 3 pet mentions. So example of controlling or coercive, using animals to control or coerce a victim, threatening to harm or give away pets, the emotional, psychological abuse. So actually they're using the pets to intimidate, to cause distress, threatening to harm the animal. So it's within this act, we've got that additional element of actually threatening. So under the Animal Welfare Act, if you're meeting all the needs, you're not causing physical harm to the animal, there's probably limited in what you could do under that, but actually under this, it's just the threat of harm as well. And then also, which we see quite relatively frequently on the services as well, is the use of GPS trackers. So knowing where you are at all times when you're walking the dog, because they've got a GPS tracker on. So something we have to be really cautious of on the pet fostering services as well. It's really important to remember that this list is something that may happen where we see domestic abuse, but it also may not happen when we see domestic abuse. And also, if we see these physical signs, these limited access to food, water, it also doesn't necessarily mean there's domestic abuse happening. But we always share them as potential things to be looking at, to be considering when you are looking at the whole picture. We've spoken a lot around those physical signs, so non-accidental injury, trauma, but does the animal have the right access to food or water? Is it heavily controlled, and is it under ridiculous reasons as well? So quite often we hear that food's too good for the dog, you're wasting your money on that food for the cat. So are there specific rules that relate to how the victim survivor can care for the pet? Is there a lot of control over the animal? You know, one day they're allowed in this room, another day they're only allowed in the garden. Is just like a victim survivor's life might be controlled, is the animal's life also heavily controlled as well? Because of that lack of vet care, lack of finance to access vets, we might see parasite infestations, we might see very untreated illnesses and conditions. And again, behavior can be, you know, related to so much in an animal's life. It's really difficult to really correlate that. But if we're seeing certain fear from one person in the home, if we're seeing, you know, hiding, if we're seeing that actually the animal's not allowed out to go out on walks, because again, that's an opportunity for the victim survivor to reach out for help. And then just like domestic abuse perpetrators often may have other criminal history links, there may also be criminal links in relation to animal welfare crimes, dog fighting, anything else that maybe have a potential element to the animals in the home as well. I've got a few minutes left, I think. So just really quickly to touch on microchips, and I will say I'm only familiar with microchip setups and databases, processes within the UK. But actually, as an example, we also met with an organisation in the Republic of Ireland recently, and this is an example of all of the professionals that have access to data on the microchips. I'm sure you all know as well, vets, vet practices, animal welfare organisations, dog wardens, local authority, police. When we know that a victim survivor has fled, given up everything, changed every part of them, changed their name, changed the school the children go to, what can actually be a really big risk factor is the details that are on the microchip. Because as we've seen in the past, perpetrators have coerced and threatened veterinary practice staff to look up the details on the microchip to see what address that animal is registered at, as well as having friends and family members within these sectors and asking them to look up the details, which you can imagine the risk of finding that victim survivor's new address after fleeing could be absolutely crucial for both the victim survivor and the animal as well in relation to their safety. So just to summarise a couple of the key elements that we talk about with professionals around safety planning with domestic abuse and pets. To really early on consider what are those options for temporary care. Are they able to go with the victim survivor wherever they're going? Is that an option to explore? Or do we need to look at if there are any friends, family, boarding, pet fostering services? Thinking about removing the pets as quickly and as safely as we can as well. The longer the perpetrator has access to the pet, the more risk can come to that animal. Have a look around your own microchip processes as well, and just understand sort of the risks around that. Have a think about if there's any perpetrator animal risks. So for instance, again, it's not uncommon for us to have perpetrators that are within police forces, are within veterinary practices. Again, if they've got that additional authority to be looking up data and asking, you know, for vet history on animals, thinking about what other risks could come with that. Use of pet GPS trackers, again, when people are looking to flee, are there any trackers on the collars, anything like that that could be going with them? And something, again, this is something that comes up for us, perpetrators posting on social media that their poor pet has been lost or stolen, with so many shares and reposts, and actually people are trying to reunite this poor lost pet with their owner, but actually inadvertently reuniting a perpetrator with a survivor, potentially by being on the lookout for this animal. So again, just some things that we've seen happen over the years that are good to keep an eye on in relation to the safety of both pets and people.
Thank you, Amy. I think we've gone over time for that. I don't I don't think the reflection is we have time for that. But has anybody got any questions? There's a lot, very quick, a lot of information shared there, so sorry about that. I don't think we've ever tried to do it in an hour. Kristen.
Hi. I was just wondering, so I'm in Ohio in the United States, and I've been trying to work on advocating for more co-shelters in the state. So working with several agencies. I was just curious if in the UK, aside from the fostering that you talked about, is there any progress that's occurred as far as like grants for, domestic violence shelters that want to allow people to stay with their pets?
Oh, Kristen, I wish there was. So we're way behind you. Especially in Ohio, you're way much further ahead of us in this whole area. What's happening in the UK is there's less and less money for domestic abuse and less money for refuges. So we've moved very much away from this whole idea of refuge, places where survivors will go to, they'll get that peer support. We have more safe houses now than refuges, so they will be houses in the community. So in terms of our refuges, we've got very few that will accept animals. In some areas, our safe houses will allow animals. There's absolutely no reason why they shouldn't have animals in them, but we seem to have this default no pets allowed. So across our services, we're challenging that. We've got some legislation coming in, hopefully, renters' rights bill is going through Parliament, because again, private renting with animals is really hard in the UK. Very little funding other than for the absolute core statutory services that are necessary in the world of domestic abuse. So, Kristen, it's a great question, but we're way behind you.
Thank you so much. I was going to say we're actually not doing that much better in our area either. There really isn't a lot right now, but hopefully that will improve if more people listen to it.
I think so. That's why we're keen to keep getting more research done, in this area, because we need that strong evidence base. That's why we're really keen to look at that animals on the domestic abuse homicide timeline, because we need that evidence base to get the funding, to get the change. Any more questions? Maybe one more. Yeah, Susan.
I'm wondering about how often you see, or if you know of any research with veterinarians who see domestic violence survivors that come in for services for their animal and not for themselves. What that looks like, how to support that conversation, and how to bring that awareness to veterinarians. Any thoughts you have on that?
Definitely. And this is why this whole area of veterinary social work is so key and so important. So one of the things that we have done in the UK through the Links Group have been going for over 2 decades, and they've done lots of work in that veterinary space. And there's still lots and lots more to do, but it's about raising awareness about this whole issue, but then providing support to vets exactly how to broach this issue. Because of course there are lots of concerns about confidentiality. So we can go, Amy's put it in the chat, brilliant. If you go onto the Links Group website, there is some guidance for veterinarians on there. So it's very specific to the UK context, but I bet it's a good template that can be used elsewhere. It's about what we also do is the Links Group, they've been going into the universities, training undergraduate vets, just, a bit about domestic abuse, because of course our vets don't often get that training. A bit about non-accidental injury. It's a start. And then it's about opportunities for more and more training and providing that practice guidance. And it's a conversation we continually need to be having. So we've done quite a bit in that area, but we've got a lot more to do. Mindful of time. I don't know how strict with time you are.
Does anyone else have any questions, comments, or reflections that you would like to share?
Yeah, thank you so much for like doing this whole presentation, and you had to hear that an hour is not usually what you have for this. So thanks for compressing it in. Yeah, I'm currently working on setting up a foster network in my community for this same thing, and luckily there are some grants available for me to do this, and our local shelters do have cohabitive housing, but not enough of it. So that's unfortunate. And yeah, I appreciate you sharing the resources too. I have them up on my other screen, so I can read through them after.
If
Yeah.
we can support with any of that, let us know as well. Because it's if you want to jump in a call with Mary and I at any point, we'd be happy to chat through sort of some of the considerations with fostering and everything else. So yeah.
We've done some work with the link in Portugal and given them all of our templates because it's an area they're really trying to, they haven't had much luck getting the whole concept of pet-friendly refuges. So they're now looking at the fostering model. So we are happy to share everything because, as Amy said, most of it's put together because of things we've learned, unfortunately, issues, good things over the years. So we're always happy to share anything. We'll
Yeah,
put
thank you.
our emails in the chat.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Lisa,
Yeah.
did you want to say something?
I just wanted to say thank you for sharing all of this information. It was fantastic. Always hard to sit with and hear sometimes. But it's so necessary. And yes, thanks, Matt, for acknowledging it's a lot to put into 1 hour. But this was just wonderful. Thank you for sharing your expertise today.
You're welcome. Thank you for coming along. What time is it there?
It is 1 p.m. I'm also in Cleveland, Ohio, near Kristen, and we have a bunch of snow on the ground, and it is cold.
Oh, really?
Yeah, you can see back
You
in
do
Matt's
too,
background
Matt.
too.
I'm in upstate New York, so I'm like 4 hours from New York City. But yeah, we got quite a bit of snow and ice the last couple days.
Wow. No flutters over here yet. Well, certainly not where I am.
Just rain.
Just rain.
Yeah, I hope it
Drizzle.
just stays rain for you, or sun, or just clouds and no precipitation. So,
Well,
I'm gonna go
thank
ahead
you
and hit
so much again. Sorry.
stop recording. Are we okay
Yeah,
with
I
that?
am.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.